Okay, now let's talk about the facial bones. So the first one we want to touch on is the maxilla. It's the upper jawbone. This is a keystone bone of the facial bones. And keystone means, actually we had it in the sphenoid bone. I described it previously but didn't talk about it in the sphenoid bone. The keystone means all the other bones of the face are attached to the maxilla. So all the other bones we're going to talk about have a connection to the maxilla. In the skull, for the skull bones, that was the sphenoid bone. So all the bones are attached to the sphenoid bone in the skull. So this is the upper jawbone. What we have, let me take that jawbone right here. We have a side view of the jawbone. It's kind of weird looking. It's not really that regular at all. We have a few parts that come that we have to discuss here. We have the roof of the mouth. The anterior portion of the roof of the mouth is known as the palatine process of that bone, of the maxilla. Then where the teeth go in, the teeth sockets are known as the alveolar margins. I don't know why they're called margins, but they're called margins, alveolar margins. And then we have a little small piece that reaches into the cheek, and that's known as the zygomatic process. That's right in here. It's called a frontal process here, but it's zygomatic process. And that's the other one we want to learn here. And then what we also have here, which I did not list in the list, but that's the maxillary sinuses, and that's like right in here. Those are really big. They come up on a different slide, so that's, I think, probably why they're not listed right here. So don't worry, they are written down somewhere. And then the back of the roof of the mouth, so look, here is another view of the maxilla, and then this bone is the back of the roof of the mouth, and that bone is the palatine bone. There's actually two of them, one on each side, because when we're formed there is a midline that we come together. It's kind of like we close together. We close from the back anteriorly as a tube. It's kind of an interesting way of how we are made, but we'll talk more about that another time. The lacrimal bone and the nasal bones are two small little bones. The nasal bone is interesting. It's just by the nose. It's the bridge of the nose, basically. Right here. Right here. And then up here, right, that was where the glabella was in the frontal bone. This is the frontal bone here. And then behind the nasal bone, we have the little lacrimal bone, the purple one here. And the lacrimal bone is where the Sandman comes home, because that's where we can get stuck in the nasolacrimal canal. What happens is we have the lacrimal glands, the tear glands are on the outside. They're right up here behind this bone in the orbit. And then the tears come out and they cross the orbit and they drip into the nasolacrimal canal and the lacrimal bone. So that's what that bone does. So when you rub your eyes, don't rub them from the inside out, rub them from the outside in, so you don't move things against the stream of the tears, but you help the tears flush things out. I hope your mom told you that. Alright, then we have the cheekbone. And the cheekbone, as a bone itself, there's a little bone. Look at that, it's a little small little bone thing. And that's where the top of the cheek is, right here. That's called the zygomatic bone. And it has processes, it has multiples, because it's basically three things coming off of it. They can all be labeled. I put temporal process here, but it's a very small little thing, so don't worry too much about that. And then next we have the turbinates, and these are those conchas that I've already talked about. So when we breathe air in through the nose, and when you go to a cold climate in the winter, you know you want to breathe it in through the nose, because when you breathe it in through the mouth, it burns down the lungs. And that's when you actually realize what these things do. So inside the nose, this is a cross section, and inside the nose you got these things here. One here, one on top, and then the red one on the bottom. The red one is on the bottom because it's its own bone. And so we have a bone called the inferior nasal concha. The one on top are part of the ethmoid bone. So here's a frontal view. You see that thing in the bottom? That's the inferior nasal concha that rounds down like that. And so that rounding down, you also see it here, the rounding down thing helps the air coming in and circling or turbinating. This is a real nice view right here. And so that circling structure, that slows down the air and it moves it past all these surface areas right in those turbinates, going right backwards. And we have a lot of blood vessels that go right through there. And so when it's cold and the air is dry and cold, it will warm up the air heavily and make it ready for the lungs. Because when we get to the lungs, we want that air to be a specific temperature and a specific moisture. We don't want it too dry or too cold. That's not going to be good for the lungs. So that's kind of a really interesting piece of equipment that we have. I didn't think about that. I didn't until I learned. And then we got the vomer bone. And the vomer bone is really strange. It's basically it's not strange. It's just the bottom of the nose going backwards right here. It looks like a plow. Actually, vomer means plow. So it's right here that's kind of a weird picture here, but it's right here, that red thing right here going back. There you go. So we don't need more to know about that for right now. And then the mandible is the lower jawbone. So that's where the teeth are and the lower teeth are. And also that's the part that moves up and down when we breathe, when we eat. When we breathe. We have a few parts to it that we want to identify. So here, look at that. Here's where it sits, the purple one. So the ramus, look, this is a good picture. The ramus is up and down. That's the side bar that we see here. The front part is the body. And then we have these alveolar margins again where the teeth sit in. And then here we got two processes sticking out. One in the front and one in the back. The one in the back, see that reaches right into the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. Oh, right in front of the ear. So that's known as the mandibular condyle. Now this is the second time you hear that word condyle. We're going to have it again in the knee. And so and even in the elbow. A condyle is a rounded structure that fits into a fossa and makes a joint. And so the mandibular condyle is the part of the mandible that makes the joint, in this case, with the temporal bone, one on each side. Which makes it also very interesting. You have two joints that are connected, that are formed by three bones, but one of the bones is a single bone. So if you break that jaw, you're going to have a problem with the chewing mechanism, for example. So that's very interesting. Clinically speaking, it's a very delicate situation, even though chewing is such a regular thing we always do. Okay, so that's the condyle. And then when we reach to the front, we have a coronoid process, and that is just so annoying to have a thing called a coronoid process. But it's really cool because this is where the temporal bone muscle from here, the temporal muscle from here, you see that line? That's where the temporal muscle starts. Right here it comes down and reaches into that tip. And when we close that mouth, it pulls that thing up to close the mouth. So it's very powerful. We have one here, so that reaches down this way direction. And then as we will see, we have a thing that's attached here and then up here. And that closes it straight up and down. And that's another muscle called the masseter. We'll get to that. Masseter. Okay, and the last but not the least bone, here's the hyoid bone. And that's a bone in the front of the neck, below the mandible. You can touch it. And it's right superior to the larynx. When you poke in from the front, right here you have this little plow thing. It's the Adam's apple in the guys. And the ladies is there too, you just can't see it. And when you go and you touch that and you go a little bit above it, you have that bone. If you squeeze it from the side, it hurts a little bit. But then you feel it, you know what it is. It's sort of a free floater. But it's an important bone in swallowing. So stuff is attached to it, and when we swallow, it helps move the stuff up and down. So we actually don't breathe in the food type of stuff. But that's very important, but we don't really want to spend too much time on it. I just want to mention it that we know we have that bone as well. Okay. So what comes after this in the handout are a few pictures that you can print out, maybe as a big single pictures if you want to study it well. These are from a textbook. I like them. And that should be concluding the skull. I hope you learned something. Next we'll go to the facial muscles.